Hi, everybody. Hope you're doing well. In this session, I want to build on the previous couple of sessions where we've talked about the global capitalism or neoliberal capitalism and kind of the contemporary political economic structures. And I want to build on that by focusing on a specific case, and that case being Greece. So what I want to do is look at the what happened in Greece in 2015 as a way of talking about the impact of, or how this global capitalism that we've been talking about, or neoliberal capitalism that we've been talking about, how it manifests itself on the ground, and in this case in Greece in 2015. So let me first catch you up on a basic kind of conclusion that we came to in the previous session. And that was that this current contemporary political economic structure of the international world has seen a dramatic change starting in the 1970s. And that dramatic change is one where, if you remember previously, the way that the international world, the way that the international was organized in terms of what its political economic structure was, it was organized in a way in which the division of labor for the entire world was divided up geographically, so that you had parts of the world that was manufacturing, namely the core, parts of the world that were involved in agriculture and primary commodity extraction, and that was the periphery. So that what you had was an inequality that was mapped onto the world geographically. And what we said in the last session was, given the development of a transnational production scheme, that we said, given the development of a global assembly line, that division of labor globally has changed, so that now what we are talking about is no longer a core that produces manufacturing in one geographic location and a periphery that produces those other agriculture and primary commodity extraction in another location, but rather these are happening all over the world all at the same time, so that there is manufacturing happening in what used to be the periphery. And so that has meant that the inequality that mapped onto the world geographically has given way to a division of labor that is structured socially, and so inequality that is more and more social rather than spatial, so that you see the conditions of underdevelopment, or the conditions of lack of development and poverty and economic immiseration in the first world, in the former colonial places like the United States, for example, and you see the conditions of hyper accumulation or enrichment by a small group of people in the former colonies or in the former periphery. So that you, in other words, you see the third world in the first world, and you see the first world in the third world. This is tied to this change in production schemes, this change in the way that the division of labor is mapped onto the world. And so based off of that, there is a problem for the transnational elite that we talked about in the previous session. What's that problem? The problem is this transnational economy, this new remapping of production, this new remapping of the division of labor means that there is increased polarization everywhere, so that you see massive polarization occurring in the United States, and you see it occurring in a place like El Salvador. You see it occurring in Mexico, and you see it occurring in the United Kingdom. So that everywhere in the world now you are seeing the social the social inequality. Whereas before you could talk about the core as being much richer than the periphery, now you are seeing the condition of being the core in every city and the conditions of being the periphery in every city as well. And thus this increased polarization means there is increased turmoil in any given place, because anytime you have massive social inequality, you also have social turmoil. Social turmoil is it brews, it facilitates, it gives way to resistance of all kinds, it gives way to social turmoil of all kinds. So for the transnational elite, the question is, how are they going to make sure that they could persevere over, or that the structures of accumulation that benefits them are going to be resilient given the social turmoil that those very processes create? And we said that the way that this dilemma was going to be resolved partially was through the creation of, or through the distancing of, economic institutions of the state from the control and accountability of the state itself. So that we said that economic decision making is now made is being made outside of the spaces that could be held to account politically. That economic decision making is being made by independent economic institutions outside of popular accountability, or outside of the political influence that the citizenry like you and I could put on it. This was going to be, this is the way that the transnational elite have strategized around getting away from, or trying to push back against, political resistance of the average person. And thus, by doing that, by creating these economic institutions that are independent or relatively independent of the state, and thus they are buffered against the political accountability that citizens normally could force upon those institutions if they were part of the state, what that has meant is that these economic institutions, instead of being responsive to the political accountability of citizens, of voters, or what have you, they are more accountable to global market relations, to a group of transnational investors and transnational elites. This was kind of the conclusion to our previous session. Now I want to bring these conclusions, or these assumptions, and we want to see how they are going to work themselves out in a place like Greece in 2015. So to give you an idea of the problem that we are attempting to deal with, let me show you a video of what was happening in Greece in 2012. Because at the end, this is the issue that we are trying to deal with today. So here, this video is from is a clip. It's a clip of the clashes that you were seeing on the streets of Athens in Greece in 2012. Look, folks, in 2012, actually starting in 2010, the video you're seeing, the scenes of protests, of clashes between protesters and police, became a very common scene. Starting in 2010, when Greece is going to begin its financial hardships, all the way until 2012, where this video is from 2012 itself, all the way up to 2015, and so on, that Greece faced massive social turmoil as a result of the economic issues that it was dealing with in that time. So I want to first start with this, because now what I want to do is to unpack how we got to this point. So that's what we're gonna that's what I'm gonna try uh, to break down for all of us, right? So in doing so, I'm gonna tell. I want to kind of tell the backstory of how we got to that point. In doing so, I'm gonna make 2 points, or throughout the session, there are 2 main points that I'm going to drive at. One is that what you see in Greece is a case in point of the subversion of democratic demands by politically unaccountable, transnationally oriented elites who wield political and economic power. So that in Greece, what we see is the dominance of transnational elites from across the world, their dominance over the power of Greek citizens themselves. Which means then this is the subversion of the democratic demands of the citizens of one country by this global elite. 2, at a larger kind of a structural level, I want to suggest that we are seeing the transformation of citizens from their position as citizens to the position of being subjects. Subjects not of kings like we used to be back in the feudal times, but subjects of investors this time. So those are the points that I want to lay out. Now let's kind of go through the story of what happens. So there is this thing in Europe that developed that's called the Eurozone. The Eurozone is basically all of the different countries that use this currency that was developed called the euro. And this Eurozone is an economic and monetary union that currently consists of 19 countries. It doesn't include all the countries in the European Union. The European Union has 28 countries in it. Now it actually has 27 because the UK is no longer part of it. But the Eurozone is a subset of that. So 19 of the 27 countries are part of the Eurozone, meaning that they use the currency of the euro. Now, in order for countries to be part of the Eurozone, there were certain conditions that they had to meet in order to qualify. And these conditions, one such condition was that they had to have a certain amount of creditworthiness, a certain amount of debt obligations, or they had to have low debt obligations. Specifically, their debt to GDP rate, their debt to GDP ratio had to be less than 60%, and their deficit to GDP ratio had to be less than 3%. I mean, those numbers aren't important to you, but just so that you know, there was a certain threshold that every country had to meet before they entered into this monetary union. So Greece qualified to join the euro in the year 2000, and they were officially admitted on January 1st, 2001. In order to qualify to join the euro, Greece had to it had to hide some of its loans. In other words, it did not qualify, it did not meet the requirements that I just talked about. And thus, in order for them to enter into it, they had to fudge some numbers so that it could look like they actually qualify for it. So how do they do this? They did this through complex financial deals. These financial deals were created by the likes of Goldman Sachs and other heavyweight financial firms throughout the world. These heavyweight financial firms, what they tried to do was they tried to disguise what were actually loans and make them look like they were not loans. Thus, the Greek budget looked better than it actually was. And so, of course, this has to do with the fact that, you know, if you need to take out loans, if you are an individual, what you do is, like, if I'm trying to take out a loan, I either if I own a home or if I own something expensive, I use that as collateral. I go to the bank and I'm like, look, um, I put this as collateral, and based off of this, give me another loan. If you don't have something of great value, then you go to a pawn shop, and you might have something of less value, but you pawn that for a loan that then you later on pay back. In the case of a bank, what a bank does in order to see that you are worthy of giving a loan to, they run your credit and they check your credit history. They check how long you've had a job, where do you work, and all of that information. If you're a country, on the other hand, and you're not an individual, you also could get private loans from individual creditors. You could get private loans from transnational corporations, or you could get loans from financial institutions such as the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. In the case of a country, your credit worthiness is also something that is scrutinized. And your credit worthiness is based off of your country's balance sheet. The only difference is if you're a country, you might have more ability to play around with the numbers than if you were an individual. And that's what Greece did. So and Greece wasn't the only one. Greece and other countries, what they did was they hid their debt obligations. And they got help from financial firms to do that. So the way that these financial firms, what they did was they used creative financial devices such as securitization and currency swaps to hide the liabilities that any government had, or some governments had. An example of this is, and this is a quote from the New York Times. I'll read it out to you. Quote, "In dozens of deals across the continent, banks provided cash up front in return for government payments in the future, with those liabilities then left off the books. Greece, for example, traded away the rights to airport fees and lottery proceeds in years to come. Critics say that such deals, because they are not recorded as loans, mislead investors and regulators about the depth of a country's liabilities," unquote. In other words, a bank like Goldman Sachs, for example, would give Greece some money. And what Greece would give in return, Greece would say, well, I will give you in all of my future taxes or fees that I collect from an airport or from a port or from something like that, something where there's kind of guaranteed or guaranteed payments that will be coming in from it to a government like Greece. So Greece said, you could have all of these payments in the future in return for you giving me X amount of money. And so by getting that X amount of money, what they could show is that, and they get that money, they pay off certain loans, so then it looks like they don't have any loans on the paper. But what they actually have is they do have a loan. They have a loan in which it's going to take a certain amount of the revenue that they were going to otherwise receive in the future. That revenue is going to go towards this loan if they don't pay it back. So they're actually in debt, but in the bottom line, on the spread, on their financial forms, it doesn't look like they have that debt. In that particular case that I quoted from the New York Times, Goldman Sachs was paid $300 million in creating that transaction itself. And they did other mechanisms as well. In 2002, Sachs did this other thing called currency swaps to also push back Greek debt into the future, so it looks like Greece doesn't have any debt. What this operation, these types of currency swaps and these financial deals that Goldman Sachs and others did amounted to approximately $15 billion of bond sales that allowed the government to hide the extent of its deficit. It also helped Greece raise $1 billion without it showing up on its balance sheet. And so Greece was able to hide the fact that it was actually a lot more indebted than it actually looked like, than it looked in public. So they were so successful at this, Greece, with the help of these financial firms, that in June 2003, the Standard and Poor's rating agency upgraded Greece's long-term debt from A to A plus, which is means you're credit worthy, right? That you have good credit. Standard and Poor's, by the way, is a private firm. It's a financial firm. It's a private firm whose job is to give these ratings. They give these ratings to companies. They give these ratings to countries as well. So you just understand the fact that a private firm is the one that designates the creditworthiness of the country. And thus, this is extremely important because if S&P says that a country's credit is not good, then that country is going to have such a hard time finding loans globally. And thus, the ratings that Standard & Poor's puts out is of extremely high importance. And so Greece was able to get a very good credit rating because of the financial deals that Goldman Sachs did for it in order to hide its debt obligations. In other words, what happened in the process of Greece qualifying to be part of the Eurozone was that financial firms helped Greece, and the financial firms produced financial products. Goldman Sachs and others produced financial products. These financial products had the effect of hiding Greece's debt obligations. So these private firms produced these financial products. Other private firms bought those financial products so that the financial market creates the product, the financial market buys the product, and then other firms within the financial market were the ones regulating that entire marketplace. Standard & Poor's, for example, are the ones regulating and saying how creditworthy is a country like Greece, so that the production, consumption, and regulation of all of this process all happened within the financial market itself. The production, consumption, and regulation of the creation of financial products all occurred within the private sector itself without any kind of public involvement, right? This is part of the global marketplace. So far, so good, right? Well, what happens in 2010 is the Prime Minister of Greece, then George Papandreou, comes out and announces that, hey, guys, look, Greece cannot pay any of its money back. It cannot pay the creditors it owes. It actually has all of these debt, and it has a bunch of payments it has to make to its own people as well. Greece is insolvent, he said. And this, just so you put it into context, what had happened in 2008 was a financial crisis that starts in the United States, but given the interconnectivity of the financial market throughout the world, a thing that starts in the US quickly hampers and affects banks and investment firms across the Atlantic and across the world. So by 2009 and 2010, Europe is also facing recession and is also facing financial crises. So is there a lot of, and this has effects all over the world. It hits Greece, of course, in 2010. At that time, once George Papandreou, the Greek prime minister, announces this, everybody acts shocked about what happened, and everybody's like, whoa, we didn't know Greece was going to go insolvent. We didn't know what was happening in Greece. But in reality, it was evident for those that wanted to see it. There were a lot of debates that up to that point that, look, there were these derivative deals, there were these financial mechanisms that were being created, and none of this is being regulated. There's not a lot of transparency in doing this, but these things were just kind of put aside and not taken seriously. And then later, when you saw the ramifications and the consequence of that, everybody said, oh, everybody acted shocked. So at that point, once 2010 hits, once Greece says, look, we are insolvent, there's a decision that has to be made. How are we going to deal with this crisis? The person you heard from in your readings, the former Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis, he puts it like this. He said that at that point, Greece faced a fork in the road. It faced a decision that it had to make. There were two choices. There was one choice in which what you would do is you restructure the debt that you had. You basically go into, if somebody goes bankrupt, what you do is the bankruptcy lawyer or the judge comes in and says, look, they bring all the creditors and they say, look, creditors, you're not going to be able to get all your money back. So they renegotiate the debt. So here, the Yanis Varoufakis says that one thing you could do is you restructure the debt and you reform the Greek economy. And so what happens in that sense is the Greek government would say to its creditors, look, I can't pay you 100% of your money back. So I'll pay you 50% of it back. And then it tells its people, look, you know, all those measures and all those policies, all those various social programs that I had promised you, I can't do those all. So I'm going to have to cut some of those as well. So you cut a little bit with the creditors, you cut a little bit with your social expectations, and you restructure this debt and you try to reform and recover the economy so that you could get back on your feet. That's one option. Varoufakis calls this the sensible one that any decent banker would recommend. Then there's the other option, and that was you get loans. So you owe creditors money. You get new loans and you use those loans to pay back your creditors. And now you owe the new person money. And then you move on, right? The problem with that is that you haven't dealt with the fact that you're still insolvent. So now you just owe more money just to a different set of people. And in a way, that's what happens. That's the choice that is made for Greece. But before we get there, let's go back to this point. So you have a choice that you have to make. The question is, who gets to decide? Who decides which path you take? Who decides which option you take? And the decision maker in this case was the Eurogroup. The Eurogroup, remember I said the Eurozone was the 19 countries that use the currency, the euro. Well, the Eurogroup is the grouping of the finance ministers of all of those different 19 countries in the Eurozone. Those finance ministers, this Eurogroup was going to decide what Greece had to do. And the agreement that the Eurogroup would come to would then be carried out and monitored by this thing called the Troika. And the Troika was basically the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. So you see these folks down here. This is the Troika. So the key people, some of the key players that were going to decide how Greece was going to move forward included Juncker, who was the president of the European Commissioner, the Dutch finance minister, who was at the time the president of the Eurogroup. This is this gentleman here. This is Juncker right here, the president of the European Commission. Mario Draghi, the president of the European Central Bank. Christine Lagarde, who is this woman here. She was the director of the International Monetary Fund at the time. And the Wolfgang Schäuble. Wolfgang Schäuble is the German finance minister. And this is the gentleman here. At the time, he was the German finance minister. So this was the group that was going to decide what Greece was going to do. Here is Yanis Varoufakis talking about the Eurogroup. He says, look, the Eurogroup does not exist in law. There's no treaty which has convened this group. He says, Varoufakis says, quote, so what we have is a non-existent group, talking about the Eurogroup, a non-existent group, meaning non-existent in terms of law, in terms of policy. It's a non-existent group that has the greatest power to determine the lives of Europeans. It's not answerable to anyone, given it doesn't exist in law. So no minutes are kept and it's confidential. And here's the key. So no citizen ever knows what is said within. These are decisions of almost life and death, and no member has to answer to anybody. And remember the key point that I mentioned earlier on, the creation of economic institutions that were not responsive to citizens or to the political accountability that citizens could wage. And so here, Varoufakis is making this point about the Eurogroup, that the Eurogroup is confidential. People don't know what happens in there, and thus they are not responsive to people, to citizens, yet they have a lot of power in making decisions that determine the lives of Europeans. So these were the guys who were going to make the decision. And here's an interview with a European, the ambassador of the European Union to the United States. So you could see kind of at the time what they were saying. This is in 2012.
Greece is on the right track, and we are on the right track to support the Greek government, the Greek authorities, the Greek political parties, and the Greek public opinion and the Greek population overcoming this very difficult situation. I think one needs to understand that we are dealing with the aftershocks of the financial crisis. It has affected the whole world, but it has affected some countries more than others, those who have more vulnerable situation. This is the case of Greece. That's why Greece needs help. That's why we are ready to provide help. We are very happy to see a solidarity of the International Monetary Fund as well. And we are sure with this kind of help, with the efforts that the Greeks have to produce themselves, I think we will come to a solution to this crisis.
Of course, critics say that that the EU approach to Greece has been too focused on cuts and not really enough on economic growth. What would you say to them?
What we want, what Greece wants, what Greek population wants is a sustainable growth. Not 1 year growth or 2 years growth and then 5 or 10 years of recession. No, we want to create the conditions for a sustainable growth pattern in Europe and in Greece in particular. For that to happen, you need to first deal with the emergency situation. And we had a public financing situation in Greece, which was unsustainable. We need also to look at the structural reforms, create the conditions for competitiveness for our economies, in this case, the Greek economy. Only on that basis can one expect to have sustainable growth in the decades to come.
Of course, there will be elections in April, and that could be another sort of crisis point that could put this package into doubt or throw it into greater turmoil. Do you expect that might happen, or how do you see the elections in April affecting the bailout package?
First of all, elections are a good thing. They are part of democracy, and democracy is the system we have chosen to live in, and we should have no problem with elections. I believe that's also a way for the population to express their views, for politicians to assume their responsibilities. In any case, the package that has just been approved is subscribed and supported by the main political parties in Greece. So I see no reason why, regardless of the results of the elections, this agreement should be put in question.
So as you could see, the European Union is, here's the ambassador of the European Union to the United States, and he's talking about the importance of democracy on the one hand, and the importance of sustainable growth on the part of Greece. So what do they actually get? That's what they're saying publicly. So then what actually happens? Well, in 2010, the Eurogroup pushes an agreement between the Greek government and the Troika. This is on May 3rd, 2010, which is called the First Economic Adjustment Program for Greece. You know, the name should give you some deja vu, right? We talked about structural adjustment programs. Here you have the First Economic Adjustment Program. This program is going to be followed by 2 more in 2012 and in 2015. The first program in 2010 made available 110 billion euros for Greece, but under very strict conditions. Under strict conditions, which I'll talk about in a minute. But this money, the 110 billion euros, it was called a bailout. However, the people it bailed out were the creditors, because what the bailout called for was that this money that was being given to Greece would have to use to pay back the private creditors it owed, which meant that the creditors included people like individual investors as well as private institutions such as banks and financial firms. It meant that those people who had made a bet on Greece, who had invested in Greece, now that Greece can't pay that money back, they got all their money back. They got all their money back because this bailout from Troika sent money to Greece, and Greece had to use that money and give it only to the creditors. In addition, the loans that were given to Greece in 2010 and 2012, and also in 2015, created and pushed for austerity measures, very strict austerity measures that Greece had to accept. What these austerity measures included was, and this should sound familiar to you by now, cuts to spending on social services and infrastructure. That Greece had to privatize public assets that included public infrastructure such as airports and ports. The Greek government had to increase taxes. It needed to take money from that were sitting in pension funds for some of its own people, and they had to increase the retirement age to generate more money. The Greek government also had to provide incentives for private sector investments and foreign direct investments through policies like labor reforms, which meant basically get rid of regulations regulations on wages and working conditions for workers. The idea here was these austerity measures was pushed on Greece, the Greek government, to force the Greek government to come up with more and more money. And then that more and more money the Greek government would have to use to pay back now the Troika, because the Troika had paid back the Greek investors. So if you step back and you look at what happened was you have three players now. In the middle here, you have the Greek government. Here, you have the creditors, the creditors that had loaned Greece money. And then over here, you had various different European countries and European institutions, other public funds. The Greek government is a public entity. These European governments are public entities. And then you have private creditors. The Greek government can't pay the creditors. Here comes these European governments who give money to the Greeks, and then in order for Greece to pay back the creditors. Now the creditors are out of the picture. They get their money back. Who's left on the hook? You have the Greek government that now has to pay back these European governments, and these European governments who want that money and where do they get their money from? They got their money from their own tax base, their own revenues, their own people. So in other words, here's the Greek government with its people that have to pay back these other European governments who got money from their respective people. So now this public has to pay back that public, and the people who get off scot-free are the investors. So in reality, the people who were being bailed out were the creditors. The European governments and the Troika were using their own funds to pay back private institutions and investors who loaned Greece money. Now the people on the hook were on the one side Greek citizens who needed to pay back the debts, and on the other side European citizens such as Germans who were footing the bill. It's one set of people and another set of people. And here at this point that pundits, politicians, and business people started to go after and create scapegoats amongst people. In other words, what they started to do was they started to pit one set of people against the other. They started to pit the Greeks against the Germans. They started talking about, look, the reason why the Greeks owe all of this money is because of the culture of Greece itself. That Greece is in this Mediterranean climate. People are kind of lazy. They don't work that hard. They retire early. And there's a kind of a culture of corruption there. And it's all of these kind of cultural baggage that comes in, that is in Greece, that created this economic problem for them. And on the other hand, they said, on the other hand, you could contrast Greece with a place like Germany, where you have people who are a lot more hardworking. The climate is a little bit colder. People work harder. People save more. They're more frugal. They're more efficient. And this is why you see Germany having the money that it has. And this is why Germany, who is more better at kind of saving money and better at making money and better at financial planning, in a sense, being the one that has to come and save the Greeks, who are just kind of more relaxed and more lazy. People were set against each other, one public against the other. An American commentator wrote, quote, "The land that invented democracy used it to perfect the art of living at the expense of others." In this discourse, in this rhetoric, the people who are not talked about are the global investors. They're righteous. There's no kind of moral critique that is made of them. The moral critique is made of the Greek lax culture, the cultural deficiency that is present in Greeks, in contrast to the Germans, for example, who don't have that cultural deficiency. If you actually look at the numbers, however, another story emerges. If you look at the numbers, it's very clear that this is a discourse that is meant to set one set of people against the other and to divert the attention away from some of the real structural issues. Because if you look at the numbers, the difference, if you look at the average age of when people retire, when their first pensions is received, this is in 2012, the Germans retire later at 61 years, the Greeks retire at 57.8 years. However, if you look at the average weekly working hours, in Greece, people work 42 hours a week, as opposed to the Germans who work 35.3 hours. So if you put the two together, that means there isn't that much of a difference in terms of hard work that people in one country are doing as opposed to another country. If you look at another set of numbers, if you look at the average number of actual weekly hours of work in a job, the Greeks are working 40 hours a week, and the Germans are 40.1, and the Germans are right there with them at 40.4. So not much difference. But if you look at also the average collectively agreed normal annual working time, so the number of hours you work per year, the Greeks, the Germans are working around 1,600 hours a year, whereas the Greeks are at 1,800 hours, right? So here's the Greeks, here's the Germans. All in all, this is to say that there is no such thing of people working hard here and those people working less. There's no cultural difference that is the key difference between Germany and Greece. The real difference is the structural difference, the structural makeup of these markets and what they're doing to these different countries. You know, anytime anybody tells you that the reason for a reason for difference in a given society is the amount of work that one set of people do as opposed to another, you need to be skeptical of them. It's very unlikely that you have a situation where a group of people are not working that hard. In the United States, everywhere you look, people are working really hard. It's untrue that there is a set of people that don't work that hard. The difference in outcomes of why one person has a lot of money and the other person doesn't have a lot of money is very rarely the amount of work that somebody does. In fact, many people who are the poorest amongst us are also the ones that work the hardest. They're the ones that work the longest. So it's not really the culture most of the time. There's other conditions. So the scapegoating that occurs is a ruse. It's a ruse. It's not really true. It's a distraction from the real point. The real point, what is happening at that time, is that the Greek government had signed two sets of contracts with two sets of people. It had signed a contract with investors, and it had signed a contract with its own people. With the investors we talked about, it had also signed a contract with its own people. It had told people, look, you work, give me some taxes, give me part of your money. I'm going to take that money and I'm going to put it in a fund. We'll call those the pension funds. Once you work like 20 for some years, when you're ready to retire, then you get that money back, plus some interest. That means, so the government had gone into two contracts with two people, with its citizens and with these investors. And what ends up happening as a result of this crisis, when Greece is unable to pay both of these people back, it is forced to decide that I will pay back this contract and I won't accept or I won't abide by this contract. So I'm not going to break this contract, but I will break this contract. I won't break my contract with creditors. I will break my contract with my own citizens. I'm going to cut my pension funds. I'm going to raise your retirement age. I'm going to go against all of the things I said I wouldn't do in the contract that I have with you, my citizens, but I will abide by all the contracts with you, the creditors that are global. And it's important to note, these creditors are Greek, they're German, they're American, they're Saudi, they're Chinese. Creditor. When I'm talking about creditors, these are global creditors from all over the world, financial firms from all over the world, banks from all over the world. So that, to say it differently, which we could say is that austerity measures in this case were an abdication of the social contract, of the contract between people and their government, between the state and its citizens, in favor of contracts between the government and the global elite, the global rich, the global economic elite. Unfortunately, these austerity measures during a period of economic contraction and economic slowdown could cause further slowdown and further decrease of economic activity, which leads to decreased government revenues and further limiting its ability to pay back its debt. So severe were the austerity measures imposed on Greece that, according to leaked IMF minutes of a 2010 meetings, even the staff of the IMF already knew what was going on and were trying to sound the alarm. Because what is austerity measures at a time when the economy is slowing down, austerity measures which then force the government to slow down the amount of money that is pumping into the economy, means that the economy is going to slow down even further. Well, if the economy slows down even further, where is this government going to make that money that it needs to pay back the creditors and to begin with? So that if you're telling Greece, look, first I'm going to give you these loans, pay back all of its creditors, now you have to pay me back, but you also have to enter into austerity measures. What you're telling Greece is implement policies that slow down your economy at the very same time that I'm telling you you need to give my money back. So I'm going to slow down. Your economy now is going to slow down, so you're making less money. So then what money do you have now to pay back the new creditors that you have? The leaked memos of the IMF said, quote, an upfront debt restructuring would have been better for Greece, although this was not acceptable to the Euro partners. A delayed debt restructuring also provided a window for private creditors to reduce exposure and shift debt into official hands. That the IMF knowingly, instead of restructuring the debt, wanted to make sure that creditors were not really affected by the economic crisis of Greece. The IMF said, this is an actual quote from these meetings, it said, quote, should debt sustainability concerns prove to be weighing on investor sentiments, a more front-loaded approach to debt relief would need to be considered. So the key here is what the IMF is saying at that time, before they give loans to Greece to pay back their creditors, they're like, the reason why they're going to go with, you know, when Varoufakis said that you have two options. You either restructure the debt, which is the good option, he said, the sensible option, or the toxic option, you give loans to a failing economy to pay back its creditors, and then you tell them to pay you back. At the time, the IMF also understood what was happening. And the IMF knowingly then decided to go with a toxic option of giving an economy that was in dire straits further debt or further loans. An economy that already couldn't pay back its loans now had more loans that it had to pay. And the IMF said, they were going along with that unless they said, if the debt sustainability of Greece proved to weigh on investor sentiments, then we'll change our decision, and then we'll try something else, and then maybe we'll restructure the debt, and maybe then we'll come up with other creative ways of dealing with the situation. Meaning that the thing that would change the IMF's decision was the sentiments, the feelings of investors. That if the investors said something else, then the IMF would do something else. Remember, I said economic institutions were made independent of political accountability. Now they're no longer accountable to citizens, but rather now they are accountable to global market relations. Now they are more accountable to the global marketplace. Now they are more accountable to a set of transnational elites in the marketplace. This is them saying that we will change our mind if the investors feel differently about it. That's an admission. This is how, if you remember, I described neoliberalism, the goal of neoliberalism, as a global market that rules the world, that is protected by governments. It's a world ruled by the market, protected by governments. Here you see how the rule by the market occurs. The rule by the market occurs when international institutions like the International Monetary Fund are listening for investor sentiments. They're not listening to what are the sentiments of citizens in Greece, what are the sentiments of citizens in Germany or other places. They're looking at what the sentiments are of investors are. It is an admission that when it comes to economic policy, the voice of the Greek people or the Greek government is not as important as the demand of the investors. It is an acknowledgement that economic policy is accountable to the global investor class rather than the public at large. So this happened in 2010, this happened in 2012. But at the same time that was happening, there was massive resistance to this process. This resistance leads to, in January 25th, 2015, there were elections and a coalition of the radical left, known by its Greek acronym Syriza, comes to power. And they come to power under a platform in which they said, we are going to resist austerity measures and we are going to renegotiate with the Troika and our European partners, because these austerity measures are not working for our people. And so at that time, one of the things that they do, the Syriza is negotiating with the Europeans again in 2015, because the bailouts of 2010 and 2012 did not save Greece. Greece fell into more and more debt predictably. And thus in 2015, they needed another set of cash injections from the Troika. And so the Greek government is debating and they are negotiating with the European, with the Eurogroup. And so this time their strategy is they negotiate and they take the proposal of the Eurogroup and they say, instead of us saying yes or no to it, we're going to put it up for a vote. There will be a referendum on this proposal. Let's put it up to a vote and see what people say. Meaning, if we believe in democracy, let the people decide on what they want in terms of these set of austerity measures. The second that they announced this vote and they start and people started to deliberate this, the European Central Bank responds by shutting down a lot of the money that they would send to Greek banks. So this is what happens on the streets of Greece as a result of the European response to the decision by the Syriza party to put the European proposal for another set of loans from the Eurogroup to a vote on a referendum.
Greek pensioners lined up outside banks, desperate to access their monthly payouts. With banks closed until after a referendum on bailout proposals, cash withdrawals from ATMs have been limited to €60. Pensions were supposed to be exempt from capital controls, but conflicting information has left some frustrated with the government's actions. We're waiting for our pensions that we've been working for our whole lives, and they're fooling us, and we're waiting here like beggars to withdraw our own money, the fruits of our labor. This is what we're waiting for, and they're fooling us. They're keeping us outside. No one has come out to inform us. The TV channels are now saying one thing, and in an hour they say something else. They're driving us crazy, everyone. Of course we're worried. I'm not so heartless as to not be worried. Everyone is worried, but I'm expecting worse to come. Despite the breakdown of talks over the weekend, EU officials are continuing efforts to salvage a deal with Athens. Anti-austerity demonstrators are expected to continue protests outside Parliament, with a pro-Europe demo scheduled for Tuesday, as the country hurtles towards a default and a possible Eurozone exit.
So what you could see here is the European Central Bank puts pressure on Greece by putting pressure on its people. So it knows here's people who have to go on to a referendum to vote on this proposal, and they're saying to the Greek people, look, if you go against these austerity measures, this is a sign of what could happen to you even more. If you don't go along with our proposal, you're going to have even more problems. Your banks are going to shut down, and this is just a sign of things to come. They were trying to basically, in other words, threaten the people by putting them in harsher conditions. So the vote happens, and this is the result of the vote.
There was quite some celebration in central Athens tonight. Greece's no voters felt proud of themselves. Like their controversial prime minister, they stood up today to their country's powerful creditors, the IMF and the European Union. After 5 years of hopeless austerity misery, their message was clear. No more. But what now?
I don't know what is going to my country tomorrow. I don't know. I hope they come to a compromise, but I don't know.
There's no money, but little by little we'll be okay. We're hungry before, and now we'll stay hungry. But at least we stood up today to Angela Merkel.
The no voters here in St. Agnes Square are delighted to have got their voice of protest heard. But behind the music and the celebration is a sense of confusion and of fear. Whatever Greeks voted today, yes or no, the vast majority say they want to stay inside the Eurozone. But will that be possible? Greek banks are shut and fast running out of money, and no one knows what's going to happen tomorrow. Television coverage of the referendum here was as self-conscious as it was dramatic. Greeks know the rest of Europe is watching, with bated breath. The impact of today's vote will be felt not only in Greece, but throughout the Eurozone. Buoyed by the backing of their people, which they say strengthens their bargaining position. The Greek government now is upbeat about finding a new bailout deal.
With this now, we will try to cooperate with our partners, and we will invite them one by one to see if we can find some common ground, and we will try to be positive. As of tomorrow, Greece will go back to the negotiation tables, and our primary priority is to reinstate the financial stability of the country.
But is that realistic? Or are Greeks celebrating the no votes tonight, dancing on the edge of a precipice? Greece now has to wait.
So the Greek public votes overwhelmingly against this referendum, and thus they tell the Eurogroup in a sense that we don't want more austerity measures. And so in response, the next day, so now it's seemingly that here you had these elections and people said, we don't want any austerity measures. We want another type of agreement. The next day, surprisingly, this occurs early in the morning.
Greece's outspoken finance minister has resigned. Yanis Varoufakis announced he will step down just one day after Greeks voted no to austerity bailout measures. The frontrunner to replace him, seen here carrying the red folder, is Greece's chief negotiator with international lenders, Evklidis Sakalotos. A brief message on Varoufakis' Twitter account was followed up with a statement explaining that he had been made aware that some Eurozone members considered him unwelcome at meetings of finance ministers. He added, "I shall wear the creditors' loathing with pride." Varoufakis' successor was expected to be confirmed after a meeting of Greek political leaders. Meanwhile, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, under pressure over Greece's future in the Eurozone, plans to meet French President Francois Hollande later today in Paris. As the Greek president sat down with party leaders, analysts with several major banks said a Greek exit from the Eurozone was now the most likely scenario.
So what ends up happening at this point is that the Greek government is forced to, despite the fact of what the referendum said, to enter into the negotiations and still accept the austerity measures that were proposed to them. And the Greek finance minister was forced to resign because they saw him as the Eurogroup just didn't want to deal with him. And so as a result, the Greeks had to, they entered into another bailout in 2015. By 2016, this was the conditions. This is Alexis Tsipras, which you saw, the Greek finance minister. He writes in an op-ed, he says, quote, this is after all of that happened and the Greeks were forced to enter into another bailout agreement with the Troika despite people voting against it. He said, look, unemployment in Greece stands at 28%, which is at 60% for young people. The average income has decreased by 40%. Public debt has gone from 124% of GDP before the bailouts to 180% of GDP. Much of Greek assets have been sold at rock bottom prices to global investors. All of this was done through the pressure from an unaccountable group who, through bailout agreements, has oversight over the Greek economy, effectively sidelining its own government. Think about that. Think about that last sentence. All of this was done through pressure from an unaccountable group. That should remind you of the independent economic institutions without political accountability, who through bailout agreements, he says, has oversight over the Greek economy, effectively sidelining its own government. So that this was an example of how an economic institution that is independent of Greek political accountability forces the Greek government to be disciplined by and force it to be governed by the global marketplace, right? So this is where the Eurogroup is. The Eurogroup acts on behalf of and for the global marketplace and puts pressure on the Greek state to do something. And regardless of what the citizens of this state say, the state is unable to push back on the global market relations. So that here what you have is a world in which the market rules the state, right? The state has become subordinated to the global market, and this subordination is facilitated by these independent economic institutions. So to see kind of clearly the how this is playing out. Look, what I'm trying to say is this isn't something that is that is unknown to people, or something that I am putting out as an analysis. This, if you talk to some of these people in the Eurogroup and some of the people who support these decision making, they are very comfortable in saying that sometimes people should not have the ability to hold states to account. So let me show you this one final clip of a debate. Oops. Let me. So here is a video where you could see the back and forth between the Greek finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, and the German finance minister, Schäuble, Wolfgang Schäuble. Check out what he says.
Greece's chronic malignancies cannot explain the depth and stubbornness of our current crisis, of what has become, sadly, Greece's Great Depression, our 7-year-old and long winter of discontent. To explain this, one needs to cast a critical gaze upon our monetary union's design faults and how they went, these design faults of the Eurozone, went into an unholy alliance with our nations, the Greek nation's failings, to produce a monster of a crisis in Greece, one that has degenerated into a humanitarian emergency, and one crisis and emergency which has global significance.
In Europe, we have good reason not to provide financial assistance without demanding something in return. And we do not provide help if a country doesn't use it to help itself. A lot of people underestimate the problem of moral hazard. But if you separate decision-making power from accountability, and if you separate opportunity from risk, you can't succeed. Debt relief and permanent transfers wouldn't solve a single structural problem. They would weaken the incentives to carry out reforms. And they would create a problem of moral hazard in political terms, namely the experience and expectations that others will bear the cost of a country's own actions or failure to act.
Greece went from a period before 2008 of Ponzi growth, fueled by unsustainable borrowing, to a period of Ponzi austerity, which is what I call serious, stringent austerity funded by unsustainable borrowing.
As long as you give them whales, you will never get the hard decisions you have to take. That is what I call. You know, any democratic system, in my long experience, tends to take the more comfortable decision if you have the alternative to do so.
Look, if you didn't catch that, I want to replay it for you. So what Wolfgang Schäuble is saying is that there is a problem of moral hazard in which people may take the easier decisions because they feel like they're not going to be held to account, or that if you give people an option, they will always take the easier option. So listen to him again.
You will never get the hard decisions you have to take. And that is what I call. You know, any democratic system, in my long experience, tends to take the more comfortable decision if you have the alternative to do so.
That's a profound statement. he says any democratic system is more likely to take an easier decision if that easier decision is available to them. Meaning that democratic systems cannot be trusted in making difficult decisions, because when they are faced with difficult decisions, they're unwilling to take the hard route, and they will always take an easy route. And thus, we cannot rely on the judgment of a democratic process. Listen to it again.
My long experience tends to take the more comfortable decision if you have the alternative to do so.
So what he's arguing is that if we that democratic systems cannot be relied on to take some of the more complicated, decide on some of the more complicated issues such as the economy. Which means what? It means that when it comes to the economy, we need others to decide, not the population. We need others, not popular accountability. We need others, not the masses of people that vote. These others are these economic institutions. These others are the business people of the world. These others are these transnational oriented elites. These others are experts in the economy. He's saying these others are these institutions. And we need to let them decide. And we can't just be putting all of these up to a vote or letting one government after another decide what it has to do. That it's the market rules the market itself. This is a profound statement, of course, because the question is, if in a democracy, the people are the sovereign, in other words, if they are the ones who rule, and if to rule is defined as the power to make change, and if change is increasingly occurring in the economic realm, then who is the new sovereign? Who is the one that rules? Who is the one that rules within our democracy? And here the question is, when we talk about citizenship, citizenship means that you are that you are both a political subject, somebody who could intervene on the political decision making that is going to have an effect on your life, and you are an economic subject. You also could intervene on the economic decision making that's going to have an effect on your life. That is what it means to be a full citizen. But in the current context, the people of Greece had the ability over political issues, but when it came time for economic decisions, those economic decisions, they could not make those decisions. Those economic decisions had to be made by others. So that then these other people, who by the way are not citizens of Greece, they are global elites from all over the place, those others had the ability to intervene in economic decision-making in Greece. And by extension, they were able to influence political decisions in Greece as well. So that global elites who are not citizens of Greece had more power over the Greek government than the people of Greece. Thus, the people of Greece are no longer citizens of the Greek government, rather they are subject to the power of these global elites. And that occurs because of the subordination of the Greek government to the rules, whims, and desires of the global marketplace. So the question we have to ask ourselves, over the course of the history, we've had different types of sovereigns. We had kings before. So who is the sovereign today? Before we had kings, then we had authoritarian rulers. Then we tried to experiment with democratic rule. And now we have the emergence of these global economic elites. And the question is, who's really the sovereign today? Who really is the citizen today, and who is the subject? And so I'll end with this picture in which this protester, and this protester is in Paris, France, asks, who is going to listen to the fury of the people? Thank you, folks.